this particular lesson was geared towards patterns, and that's one of the next generation science standards is patterns, and how those patterns give us properties of different substances. And so what I wanted them to see through the qualitative analysis was I wanted them to see patterns in how things reacted through different forms of testing, if it was a covalent compound or if it was an ionic compound. In terms of the procedural writing, that's really an ELA literacy standard. And then also citing evidence is also an ELA literacy standard. So, what evidence showed that this was ionic? Well, the fact that it dissolved in water or it conducted electricity. And so they can take all of that and kind of bring those things back to the standards. It's not hard to tie things into the standards, number one. And number two, a lot of the labs that we already do are standards based for science, but then the literacy piece, people don't even realize that's in there. That's already embedded. And you just have to kind of draw it out and really accentuate it a little bit more. Asking kids to cite evidence when they're doing their conclusions, where this goes next. How do you know that? Or what do you have to support that? So I think it was interesting. We had one group that said to me, Mrs. Mueller, I don't have the, I don't know where this is, I don't know where this fits in my procedure. Well, that's okay. That's why you have the green pen, to allow them to rewrite and put things into sequence. Because once they actually started doing it, they realized that their sequence was off. And so they went back to change it. Even that process is a great literacy exercise for them. It just is about engagement. Even though there were a couple of groups that were completely confused because they hadn't done their work and they hadn't completed the classwork from yesterday, the engagement piece is, okay, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? And you do this and you do that. And sometimes they're so excited about wanting to see what that test is going to show them that they're afraid to branch off and divide and conquer, so to speak. And so having to cajole them a little bit and say, okay, why don't you guys split up? Why don't you divide the work up a little bit here? That part of it, I think, in terms of engagement, even though they realize, I think they're tentative because they don't want to fail in front of their peers. So they're afraid to kind of go out and come back with a test result, because that is the test result for your lab group. So that, to me today, the biggest thing was engagement. And I could tell that because they were asking me questions about stuff, but the kids that hadn't prepared were asking me procedural questions, where the other kids were saying, well, but should this happen this way or a different way? And so even the engagement between their own groups, with their own peers. So not only with me, but with each other. And then a student one-on-one engaged with their thought process in the text and what they're writing down. So they all had something going on. I didn't have to tell anybody, hey, time to get on task. I did have to say to some people, why are you not ready? So there's a big difference between being off task and not being prepared. For this particular one, I want to look at building content knowledge. So they're building knowledge of how to use qualitative testing to identify substances. And by that content knowledge, they may already know about ionic and covalent compounds, but not knowing how to test them, which is a skill. When you start to get into lab skills, then you start to get into the 21st century science skills. And so that requires communication. It requires writing things down. It requires data recording and analysis of that data. So in all of what we did in the last couple of days, yes, they were building knowledge on how to use their literacy skills to write coherent procedures and to follow a rubric and to be able to discern what information is important and what's extraneous at the moment. But at the same time, the science content here is, how do I use these experiments? It's good for forensics. It's good for any lab work that they're going to be doing. A lot of these kids have aspirations to be in the medical profession. And so, they're going to have to know how to run these kinds of tests. And so just giving them kind of the short version of it and exposure to it, and continuing to do that in other labs down the road where they have to identify substances. And I won't tell them to run a qualitative test, but they'll be able to say, hey, remember first semester when we ran those qualitative tests, we should maybe run a couple of those. So let's get the materials out to do that. And then that way we'll be able to continue on in this lab. So this is really a skill that they're going to use later on in some of our other labs on chemical reactions, acid-base reactions, and redox, oxidation and reduction reactions. So is core action 3 engagement. And I think, you know, giving them the opportunity to work in groups, giving them the opportunity to write together, to perform the lab together, to mix and mingle with other groups, to get other groups' data, to see if, you know, they're all on the same track. The encouragement is this is not just a sit down and lecture kind of thing. This is how you're going to be working in business. You're going to be working in sectors. You're going to be working in groups. You're going to be working with another person. And so accountability is an issue. Certainly making sure that you have, you know, you're prepared, and your success is going to be dependent on that. And we saw that today. You know, the kids that were successful and had things organized were able to clean up and do things and get things finished. And the kids that weren't organized were disorganized even in the lab as to what they were doing, not even knowing kind of what was going on. In fact, the one student that was so organized, the first group that, closest student by the goggle cabinet, they were trying to rinse a beaker out that had a covalent compound in it, and they were trying to rinse it with water, and they kept thinking, why isn't this getting clean? And that's when I took out the dishwashing soap and said, we had talked about Dawn dishwashing soap being a great degreaser, and he put that into his beaker, and in front of everybody, it was a teachable moment. You know, maybe you should try this. And, you know, so they were all engaged in that. I left that group, and that conversation continued to ensue. So to me, core action 3 is about keeping the conversation going.